The wheels hadn't even lifted off the ground when I knew exactly how this flight was going to go. One glance at my bag, and the flight attendant's smirk was already curling like she'd smelled something off. She leaned toward the other stewardess and whispered, not quietly enough, "Coach snuck in?" Then they laughed. The kind of laugh people only use when they're sure you can't touch them. I didn't say a word. A row ahead, a glass of champagne sparkled in every hand. My tray? Empty. Claire looked past me like I wasn't there, like I didn't belong in that seat. Maybe the duffel bag I carried wasn't stitched in gold, but it carried something none of them had ever worked for. History, struggle, dignity. Still, I stayed quiet. I always do it first. The passenger beside me shifted away, just slightly, enough to send a message. My presence was bothering them more than the turbulence would. I folded my hands and focused on the seatbelt light. No one here needed to know who I was. They thought I was nobody. I didn't correct them. Now, before we continue, if you're watching this, hit that subscribe button to follow more real, powerful stories like this. And tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from? I'd love to know. Because what happened next? They never saw it coming, and I never raised my voice. I could feel it before I even heard it. The shift in energy, the way their glances kept landing on me like little darts. I kept my eyes forward, pretending not to notice. But people always talk loud when they think you don't matter. Claire didn't whisper this time. She held up a designer tote from another passenger and chuckled to her colleague. Now that's a carry-on. Not like that thrift store rag in 2A. Laughter. Light, cruel. It wasn't even about the bag. It never is. The flight attendant beside her giggled and said something I couldn't make out. But I didn't have to. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. Too loud, too poor, too black to belong. I stayed still. Across the aisle, a boy leaned over to peek at me, then turned to his mother and pointed. "Why is she sitting here?" The mother hushed him gently, but her eyes scanned me with the same question. I looked down at my bag. The zipper was worn, the fabric soft from years of use. It used to belong to my mother. She carried it when we had nothing but each other. It had been to more countries than most of these passengers could spell. But no one cared about that. To them it was just cheap. The drink cart came by and I was skipped again. I pressed the call button. It blinked once, then dimmed. Nothing. There's a quiet humiliation in being ignored on purpose. It's not loud, it doesn't slap you. It just sits on your chest and waits for you to shrink. I thought about what my father always told me. We don't make scenes, we take notes. So I sat there, taking notes. Claire came by once more. She didn't look at me, but I saw the quick scan of my shoes, my plain slacks, my bag, and then the same satisfied smirk. "You doing okay, sweetie?" The tone didn't match the words. That smile wasn't kind. It was a performance. I looked her right in the eye and said, "Yes, thank you." She blinked. I didn't expect that, and she sure didn't expect what came next. But I wasn't there to prove a point. I was there to observe and wait for the right moment. And it was coming. Much faster than she realized. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude, but I could already feel myself shrinking in their eyes. Not from shame, but from the weight of being constantly dismissed, belittled, misread. Another attendant walked past my row, her tray full of snacks. She paused at 2B, offered 2 options, then glanced at me. Her face stiffened, like I wasn't on her list. She skipped me. I didn't ask. I knew how this worked. Further down the aisle, I heard Claire whisper something again. The phrase, "people like her," floated through the air like a bruise. My seatmate shifted again, subtly turning his shoulder away. A physical cue that spoke louder than words. I wasn't supposed to be here. I sat in first class, but they'd mentally reassigned me to somewhere behind the curtain. From time to time, I caught the looks. Not the obvious ones, not glares or stares, but the quiet glances of doubt, of judgment. That soft condemnation of being young, black, and unbothered. It always seems to confuse people when you're both dignified and silent, when you don't flinch the way they expect you to. I closed my eyes, let my breathing slow, but the plane wasn't the only thing moving. So was the disgust in Claire's tone. At one point, I overheard her giggling with another flight attendant, saying she probably begged her way up here. That seat's wasted. They didn't say my name, but they didn't have to. They were speaking to the uniform they thought I didn't belong in. To the skin they thought shouldn't be here. To the bag that didn't cost enough. To the girl who didn't meet their version of first class. But this wasn't new. I'd been navigating rooms like this all my life, where the air was thick with false civility, where smiles hide insults. There's a unique exhaustion that comes from being tolerated instead of welcomed. I thought again of my father's words. We don't shout to be seen. We own the silence and make them look. I reached into the side pocket of the bag they hated so much and pulled out a worn leather journal. I opened it not to write, but to remind myself. This wasn't about them. I knew where I came from, and I knew why I was here. Let them laugh. Let them think their roles protected them. They were trained to serve the skies. They just forgot the skies don't belong to them. And when we landed, they were going to learn who they'd been laughing at. By the time the plane touched down, the attendants were back to smiling. Polished, professional, pleasant. The masks slipping back on, ready for the next set of passengers. Claire gave the cabin her rehearsed farewell, avoiding my eye like I was still invisible. I stepped off the plane without looking back. I didn't need to. Their part was done. The following morning, sunlight poured into the high-glass atrium of Monroe Holdings. I walked through the quiet lobby where the world didn't laugh at worn bags or make women like me feel small. Here, my presence wasn't questioned. It was expected. "Good morning, Miss Monroe," the receptionist said, rising. I gave her a gentle nod. The staff knew not to fuss. That's how my father ran things. Respectful, discreet, and deeply rooted in dignity. Upstairs, the boardroom was already humming. My father sat at the head of the table, effortlessly composed, reading through the latest performance reports for SkyNova Airlines, the same airline that thought I didn't belong in seat 2A. He looked up as I entered, his face softening with something more powerful than pride, trust. "They laughed at you?" he asked plainly. Not angry, not surprised. I nodded once. The whole crew mocked my bag, ignored me. One even called me sweetie, with a smirk like I was her charity case. He didn't flinch. Instead, he flipped a page. "Then we'll begin with personnel reform." The SkyNova acquisition had closed just days before. Monroe Holdings now controlled 70% of the airline's voting shares. Not that the flight crew had bothered to check. "They've built a culture that knows how to smile but doesn't know how to see," I said, settling into the chair beside him. "That's why I need you at the table, Sela," he replied. "It's not just numbers anymore, it's correction, legacy." I could have taken satisfaction in a press release, or in someone being fired. That's what people expect. Public spectacle, loud consequences. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about change. Measured, structural, permanent. My father handed me a folder titled Internal Audit, Passenger Experience Division. Inside was a list of names, complaints, incident reports that never made the news, but made flying a quiet nightmare for people who looked like me. And at the top of the next page, Claire Whitmore. "She's due at headquarters tomorrow," he said. "All senior flight staff are required to attend a compliance workshop." I smiled faintly, the way he taught me. No gloating, no vengeance. "Let's make sure she's comfortable," I said, because the next seat Claire would take wasn't on a plane. It was across from me. In the very boardroom she never imagined I belonged in. Claire Whitmore hated mornings at headquarters. The downtown building was too polished, the coffee too bitter, the HR reps too serious. But this wasn't her first training. She'd survived half a dozen of these. Click-through slides, corporate jargon, a staged apology video here and there. She rolled her eyes as she checked in with security. "Flight team reporting for compliance," she muttered, barely making eye contact. The security guard gave her a pass and gestured toward the 22nd floor. The elevator doors opened like they always did. Smooth, silent, sterile. Claire didn't know this morning was different. Didn't know her name had made it onto a list that wasn't just for attendance. Inside the conference room, she recognized the standard layout. Projector, whiteboard, bottled water, and stiff chairs. What she didn't expect was the woman seated calmly at the head of the long glass table. Her mouth dried. That girl. The one in 2A. Same sharp eyes, different outfit. And not just different, commanding. Sela Monroe looked up. No emotion on her face, no trace of the girl Claire had laughed about. She wasn't holding a journal now. She was holding the room. Claire froze mid-step, unsure whether to sit or speak. But Sela spoke first. "Good morning, please take a seat." Her voice was even, her tone formal. No trace of anger. That unsettled Claire more than any shouting could have. The HR director stepped in and began introductions. "This is Miss Monroe. She'll be leading our internal ethics reformation series as part of our leadership transition. She's also our majority board representative." Majority. Claire blinked. She suddenly understood the silence on the flight. Understood why that call button didn't flash red. Because someone had been watching, listening, waiting. The same girl she'd written off as a nobody now held the fate of her entire division. Claire tried to hide her nerves behind a tight smile. "So you're part of the ownership group?" Sela nodded, among other roles. Claire looked away, her cheeks burning. There was no recovery from this. No polite explanation. No way to joke it off. The worst part? Sela wasn't gloating. She was calm, professional, and unmistakably in control. The rest of the team trickled in, oblivious to the quiet storm sitting between them. They made small talk. Claire stayed silent, folding her hands in her lap. As the presentation began, Sela didn't call her out, didn't reference the champagne, the comments, the smirk, but every word about dignity, equity, and power abuse felt like it was pointed directly at her. And then came the announcement. For this program, we'll be asking certain crew members to take point as culture leads. We don't believe in easy exits. We believe in informed accountability. A pause. Sela looked at Claire. "Miss Whitmore, we'd like you to lead the internal behavior turnaround for your department." Claire's stomach dropped. "Lead it?" Sela added quietly. "You were observed, not just by me, but by others. You understand the problem. Now, I want to see if you can be part of the solution." No threats, no public shame, just an invitation to rebuild what she had helped break. And for the first time in a long while, Claire was speechless. The room quieted as the lights dimmed slightly and the projector flickered to life. On the screen appeared a single phrase in clean, bold font. "Disrespect rarely begins with shouting. It starts in silence, and we let it." Sela stood with a remote in one hand, her gaze never faltering. Her presence demanded attention without asking for it. "This is not about isolated incidents," she began. "It's about patterns, about habits we've allowed to settle into the bones of this company, until disrespect became routine and cruelty wore a smile." No one looked at Claire. But Claire could feel it, the unspoken awareness in the air. Like every word had her name behind it, even though it hadn't been spoken once. Sela clicked again. A chart appeared. Passenger complaint breakdowns by race, gender, and class. "Black passengers," she continued, "are statistically the most likely to report being ignored, spoken down to, or targeted with microaggressions, especially in premium cabins." Another click. A list of direct quotes from real complaints. "She didn't look like she belonged in business class. He said he didn't want to sit next to her. The attendant called me sweetheart in a way that didn't feel sweet." The room was still. No HR video, no generic slideshow, just truth, presented with grace sharp enough to cut through the corporate veneer. "We've trained our crew to smile," Sela said, "but we didn't train them to see." She paused, let it hang there. And that's the difference between hospitality and hostility with good lighting. Claire's stomach turned. She couldn't look away. Sela moved on. The final slide showed a 6-month timeline, headed Behavioral Culture Reversal Plan. It outlined mandatory reporting, bias evaluation, accountability audits, and crew partnerships with civil rights organizations. And then came the last bullet point. Appointed cultural leads, chosen from staff with direct history of passenger interaction. Sela closed the laptop gently and turned to the room. "I don't believe in canceling people for the sake of image. I believe in change, earned, lived, and led, which is why certain individuals will be asked to stand at the front of that change." Her eyes landed on Claire. Calm, certain. "Miss Whitmore, you're one of them." Claire's throat dried. I don't know if I'm the right." "You were the right one when you thought no one was watching," Sela said, her voice never rising. "Now we'll see what you can be when someone is." Silence. Not the silence of avoidance this time, the silence of something beginning. Claire felt her world tilt. She hadn't been fired. She hadn't been dragged publicly. Instead, she'd been placed in the center of a transformation. And the woman she thought was beneath her had just handed her a mirror and a challenge. What she did next was entirely up to her. Claire Whitmore sat in the back of the shuttle, staring out the window as the city blurred past. The silence in her own mind was unfamiliar. For once she had no defense lined up, no clever retort, no way to twist the narrative to make herself feel better. She hadn't been humiliated in that room. That would have been easier to recover from. No, what Sela did was far worse. She handed her responsibility, she handed her trust, and Claire wasn't sure she deserved either. The next few weeks weren't just uncomfortable, they were revealing. Claire was instructed to sit in on passenger interviews and read every discrimination report from the last 5 years. She listened as black passengers described the feeling of being invisible, of being monitored for reclining a seat, of being offered napkins instead of welcome drinks, of having to prove they belonged in a space they paid for. One woman cried during an interview, recalling how her son was once asked if he was lost while sitting beside her in business class. Claire said nothing. She simply sat with the weight of it. No training module had ever shown her this. One morning, Claire stood in front of her mirror before work. The uniform looked different now, not in color or cut, but in meaning. It didn't feel like authority anymore. It felt like accountability. She arrived early to her crew ethics class, took notes, asked questions. The younger staff watched her cautiously. They'd heard the stories, knew her reputation. One called her the comeback queen under their breath. Claire didn't respond. She just kept showing up. But change isn't neat, and redemption never travels in a straight line. In private, she still winced at memories from that flight. The smirk, the joke, the satisfaction she felt thinking she'd reminded someone of their place. And worst of all, how easy it had been. One night, Claire sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, report half written. But her fingers hovered over the keys. She couldn't write about reform until she faced what she had actually done. She opened a new message window, typed slowly. Sela, I don't know what I was expecting that day, but it wasn't you. I said things I can't take back. I acted like someone I'm ashamed of now. You didn't have to give me a chance. Thank you for not choosing revenge. I'm learning. It's slow, but it's real. She stared at the send button for a long time, then pressed it. No reply came that night. But the next morning on the crew bulletin board, she saw Sela had updated the cultural training schedule. Next to Claire's name in parentheses were 3 words, staff mentor approved. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't friendship, but it was belief. Claire exhaled. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time, her voice wasn't just part of the noise. It was part of the work. 3 months later, the air inside Skynova's training hall felt different. Not lighter, just clearer. As if people were finally breathing the truth out loud. Claire stood at the front of the room, not in uniform, but in a simple gray blouse and slacks. The audience was filled with new recruits. Flight attendants fresh from onboarding, eyes wide, still idealistic. She adjusted the mic, cleared her throat, and began. I used to think I was fair, she said. I smiled at every passenger, said the right things, followed the script. She paused. Her hands weren't shaking, but her voice wasn't steady either. But fairness isn't about being polite. It's about recognizing the harm we allow when we assume who belongs and who doesn't. The room stayed quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of focus. She continued. I dismissed someone once, not with a slur or a shout, just a smirk, a joke, a drink not served. And I did it because I thought I could. Because I was taught that silence was harmless, but it wasn't. Someone in the back nodded slowly. I'm here now, because that passenger didn't react the way I deserved. She didn't file a complaint, she didn't shame me online, she offered me a mirror, and I saw what I'd become. Later, as the session ended, the recruits came up one by one. Some asked for more reading. One said softly, thanks for being honest, my mom's been through that. Claire smiled, genuinely this time, not because she was trying to prove something, but because she wasn't. Upstairs, Sela watched the final minutes of the training through the glass wall. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. In the months since their first meeting, the airline's culture numbers had shifted. Anonymous feedback reports showed rising satisfaction among Black and brown passengers. Incidents were down. Internal complaints were being logged and addressed. Not ignored, but Sela wasn't measuring change by charts alone. She was watching people. And Claire had changed. Darius Monroe met Sela in the corridor, reading through the latest quarterly board report. "You took a gamble," he said. Sela didn't look away from the glass. "I didn't want her fired. I wanted to see her face." He nodded. "And now, she's earning her place in the air again." They walked side by side toward the boardroom. On the wall behind them hung a framed quote, not decorative, but earned. "Respect isn't what you offer the powerful. It's what you give when you think no one is watching." Downstairs, Claire packed up her notes and headed for the crew elevator. No badge of honor, no applause. But something had shifted inside her. She didn't feel like someone pretending to care. She felt like someone who finally understood the cost of not caring. And this time, she wasn't flying to escape judgment. She was flying to dismantle it, one flight at a time. The journalist adjusted the lapel mic on her blazer, glanced down at her notes, and smiled for the camera. Today, we're joined by one of the key figures behind Skynova Airlines' cultural transformation, Sela Monroe, board member and strategist behind the company's groundbreaking equity program. Sela sat across from her, composed, unbothered, unreadable. No entourage, no PR coach in the wings. Just her, in the spotlight, she never asked for but didn't run from. The interviewer continued, "You were on that flight, weren't you, the one that started all this?" Sela didn't blink. "Yes." "What happened?" the interviewer pressed gently. Sela looked directly at her. "They didn't see me. Not for who I was. Just what I looked like, what I carried, and what I didn't carry." "And you didn't confront them?" "I observed them, then I went to work." The interviewer leaned in. "But why not speak up right then? Most people would have demanded an apology." Sela's answer was calm, deliberate. "Because I wasn't interested in apologies. I was interested in accountability. One makes people feel better. The other makes people change." Claire sat in the crew lounge that afternoon, watching the interview on her tablet, earbuds in. Around her, attendants came and went, laughing about routes, gossiping about passengers. She stayed quiet. But the words on screen struck her like a private reckoning. "Retaliation is ego," Sela said. "Reform is legacy." Claire looked down at the small notebook in her lap. It was the same brand Sela once held on that flight. Claire had started keeping one too. Not to copy her, but because she needed a space for reflection. A way to track the person she was becoming. Suddenly, a little girl ran into the lounge, giggling. Her mother rushed in behind her. A black woman in a bright blue scarf, dragging a suitcase. Claire stood to help, instinctively now. "Let me get that for you." The woman looked surprised, not by the gesture, but by the sincerity in Claire's eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're the first crew member to offer all day." Claire swallowed. "I'm glad I could be that person." Back in the studio, the interviewer wrapped up the segment. "One last question," she said. "If you could say one thing to anyone who's ever been judged based on how they look, what would it be?" Sela paused, then said, "They may doubt your place in the room. Let them. Just make sure they can't deny your impact in it." The screen faded to black. And somewhere, far from the lights and titles, a woman who once laughed at a black girl's bag was learning what it means to carry something far heavier and far more important than a designer label. A year passed, not marked by press conferences or grand gestures, but by slow, steady shifts. Cabin doors opened differently now. Eyes met passengers with awareness instead of assumptions. The air on board felt less like a battlefield and more like shared ground. Skynova Airlines had changed. The transformation didn't make headlines every day, but it echoed in quieter spaces, in the way crews spoke to each other, in the absence of slurs whispered behind curtains, in passengers who no longer clutched receipts to justify their seat. Sela stepped down from her formal role at the end of the fiscal year. Not because her work was done, but because she knew when it was time to step aside and let others carry it forward. She didn't need a plaque. She didn't want one. Her name wasn't meant for walls. It was meant for memories. For the people who'd never forget how they were treated differently after she showed up. On her last visit to the headquarters, she walked the corridors without a clipboard, without security, without schedule, just her. In the training wing, she paused by a classroom. Claire was inside, leading a session for new senior crew, walking them through real stories, real change. Sela didn't interrupt, just watched for a moment, then left the way she came, quietly. Later that evening, Claire found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a folded note in Scylla's handwriting. "The skies belong to everyone. Make sure they stay that way." Claire tucked it into her journal. She didn't cry, but she sat with it for a long time. That flight, the one that began with cruelty and silence, had brought her here. Not by force, not through shame, but through a mirror someone was gracious enough to hold up when they could have turned away. And now, the same woman who once laughed at a bag was the one guarding the gate for who got treated with dignity at 35,000 feet. On a flight weeks later, a teenage black girl boarded holding a weathered carry-on. A flight attendant glanced at it, looked her over, and smiled. "Welcome aboard, sweetheart," she said warmly, genuinely. The girl blinked, surprised. "Thank you." That attendant, trained by Claire, that girl's bag, looked an awful lot like the one Scylla once carried. And for the first time in a long time, no one laughed, because someone had rewritten the rules. Someone who turned silence into structure, injury into instruction, and disrespect into reform. If this story moved you, let your voice carry further. Subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, where true stories meet justice and dignity. Tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? And have you ever been judged for how you looked, spoke, or walked into a room? Because sometimes the most powerful stories start with a bag that no one thought was worth noticing, and end with a legacy no one can ignore.